Okay, in this video we're going to talk about supply and demand lines as opposed to supply and demand zones. These lines are trend lines, and it's based off of Thomas DeMark's TD trend lines, but it's taken from that, but we don't use them really the way he uses them. If you Google TD trend lines, you'll see hundreds of articles about Thomas DeMark and his TD trend lines, his trading system. And basically, what he says is when you draw a trend line, most traders tend to draw trend lines from left to right. Okay, so they would draw one like this, and you can see that that trend's holding, and when it finally breaks through, it comes down and for a little bit of a trade there. But what he says is you always draw from the right of the screen to the left. Okay, so our most current line would be from this point to this point. Okay, and then we extend it right. Okay, so that's our current demand line. Okay, and our most current supply line, we have a pivot here, and we'd have to come back and try to find one higher, which we have right here. So I can crunch this up a bit. Yeah, actually we have one right here that's higher. So what we're looking for is a pivot high that's higher than the current pivot high. Okay, so we would draw one like, oops, sorry. Well, this would have been our line, okay, but it broke through that, so now our current one is like this. I'm going to bring that back out. Okay, so this would be our current supply line up here on top. This would be our current demand line on the bottom. Now what he looks for is a pivot high for supply and a pivot low for demand, but one bar after it has to have a lower high, and 2 bars before it has to have a lower high, which you see we have in this case. Okay, see if I can find an example of one that doesn't qualify. Okay, here would be one right here that does not qualify. This this pivot right here, because the two to the left do not have a lower high than the bar we're looking at, so you would not draw one on that line. And I played around with these several years ago, and they're somewhat effective, but I don't use them in that aspect. What I do is I look for pivots where there's an extreme move from that point. So like here we would before this bar happened, we'd have a line right here, coming down through here, and as you can see, it actually provided support, or yes, resistance actually, I'm sorry, and bounced right down off of that line. Okay, and then here it broke through. Now what Thomas excuse me, what Tom DeMark says is when you have a breakthrough of the trend line, then you measure your furthest distance that price moved away from that trend line, and that would be your target. So when this broke through, that would be your target on your move. Well, as you can see, that never happened. And so I will consider using these if nothing else is in the way as a target. But look at what we have here. Okay, we have a supply zone right here. Okay, so when price broke through right here, where this green arrow is, okay, we wouldn't take that trade because we want to see it get through that supply first. Okay, then when it gets through that supply, then we got another supply up here on top. So I wouldn't be taking that trade. I'm gonna clear this stuff off of here, okay? And it's the same thing with this current one that we have. Okay, when price breaks through, we've got a demand zone right here. I'm just going to move this one over. Yeah. Just leave it there. So we've got demand here. So if price breaks through this trend line right here, you know, we're not going to take that trade. We got a demand zone right below it. Okay, but if price breaks through, well, it won't let me drag it out there, but if price breaks through out at this level right here, well, now, you know, we got a little bit of movement before it gets to the demand zone. Okay, so then we have to go in and calculate our reward to risk and see if there's enough of a move before it gets to that demand zone that we'd want to take that trade. Okay, the other thing that I do differently than Tom DeMark is when I have a strong supply zone or I'm sorry, a demand line or a supply line drawn, if that line never gets hit, then I never remove it from my screen. So in other words, let's see if I can find an example here. Okay, we've got one right here. Okay, and then we've also got one right here. I'm going to go ahead and extend that up. Okay, so now when price broke through, you know, in this area right here, then we need to take a look at what's our target going to be. Okay, well, we've got a demand zone right here, all right? Okay, so there's not enough room there for us to take our trade and generate the reward that we want based off of the risks that we're doing. Or I can pretty much guarantee you there's not enough room there. Okay, because we'd have to be looking at this demand zone down here as our target. Okay, so if this demand zone wasn't here and it broke through here, well, now our target is going to be this bottom right there. That's going to be our bottom demand line. I'm sorry. So, but notice that that's not necessarily a point like right here. We can't say, okay, there's you know, almost $3 between those two. We have to also notice that as time goes on, our target's getting shorter and shorter because this line is going up. So we have to take that into consideration, that we may want this $3 to be double what we need. We might say $1.50 is would be our target on this one, because as this trend line comes up, it's moving our target right along with it. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration when you're using these lines. But the important thing I wanted to show you here is that this bottom trend line has not been broken yet, so it still stays there. It's considered demand. Same thing when we have, I'm going to go ahead and remove this one and remove this. Okay, we got one here. Okay, as you can see, it actually held right to the penny, came down here, bounced off of that one again, but when it finally broke through, then we've got our other trend line right below it, so we wouldn't have taken that trade unless it broke through the bottom trend line. Okay, and it did break through the bottom trend line, but then we got a demand zone right here. Okay, so unless we thought that we could make enough money going from 27.62 down to the top of our demand zone 26.88, not very likely. We would not have taken that trade. And as you can see, there's a very good reason why we wouldn't have taken that trade. It bounced right off of that. Okay, it works the same way with our supply lines. Okay, as you can see, once we had these two pivot highs, we drew this line. This third time it came right up to it and bounced off of it. Okay, and then once it broke through and closed above that line, which by the way, we always want to see these close above the line. Okay, well then now we got the supply zone that's in our way. So again, we don't really have a whole lot of room before we get to a supply zone. The other thing that we can use these lines for is targets. Let's say we took, where my arrows go, let's say we took this trade right here, okay, in this demand zone. Well, our target could be this top supply zone up here, which you can see it did make it up there, but a more conservative target would have been to use this trend line. And so you can see it actually bounced right off of that trend line. So if I threw an alert out saying to buy a call, I would want to make sure that if price hit this trend line, this top trend line, that we would get our 3-to-1 reward to risk, which is, by the way, that's what we shoot for, is a minimum of a 3-to-1 reward to risk when it hits our first target. Okay, we may have some that have multiple targets. They might have a 5-to-1 or a 10-to-1 reward to risk, but we want at least a 3-to-1 reward to risk when it hits the first target. So if I would have called out an alert on this trade when it came down in this zone, I would have wanted to make sure that price, the distance between where we entered that trade and this trend line, this top supply line, gave us enough reward to make it worth taking that trade. Now a lot would depend on whether we took this trade when it came down into the zone, which we probably wouldn't have because it wasn't a real strong zone there. I mean, it was decent and it did break through previous supply, but I probably would have been looking for some confirmation, so I would have waited for this bullish candle. Okay, so I might have right at the end of the day taken the trade right there when the stock's at 27.09. Okay, and our target up to that line is 29.21. So probably a good chance that there is a reward to risk in there that would have worked out for us. Most of the trades that we take are going to be based off of supply and demand, But occasionally situations arise where when we get a break of this trend line, there's enough of a move for us, and depending on if we're taking the trade with the trend, there will be trades alerts that come out that are generated because of a breakthrough of these trend lines. Hope this helps, and again, if you have any questions on how we plot these lines, send me an email, kevin@zone-trades.com.